Welcome to episode 8 of the Gary Plock Tennis Show. Today we're going to talk about Bill Tilden, possibly the greatest tennis player of all time, according to some, at least after the first part of the 21st century, or actually would that be the 19th century? 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be the 20th century, 1930s up to 1945, 50. There was no doubt in Bobby Riggs' mind, who's behind here on the American Lawn Tennis, the oldest and Bible periodical of its day in tennis. And Bobby Riggs said that there was Bill Tilden and everybody else the first half of the century. And this is the racket that he used. It's a Spalding top flight. Notice the open throat nature of the wood racket. There's Tilden's signature on one side and his caricature and some gold leaf caricature on the other side. So even back in that day, everything cycles around because we see these tennis rackets now. They've almost all got open throats. The other characteristic was no leather grip, but a leather butt cap with the Spalding logo here on the racket. So anyway, Ernie, what are your recollections about Bill Tilden in the early days?
Well, good word to use, recollection, because I just wish with all my might that I could have seen him play. I mean, there was never a tennis player like Tilden. But to start the story, he was born in 1893 in the Crickettown section of Philadelphia to a fairly large family. And
would that be the Germantown Cricket Club area?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, that club was practically across the street from the Tilden home in Crickettown. It's hard not to see that as kind of a predictive harbinger of Tilden's greatness in tennis later on, the location of their house. But one of the things to stress about Bill Tilden, young Bill Tilden, was that he wasn't really the favored child in the family. He had an older brother named Herbert, who was kind of the center of the glory as far as the parents were concerned. And that included athletically as well as academically. And Bill certainly must have felt some of that in terms of, he had to measure up to someone else that was getting all the attention. And he did take up tennis just as Herbert did. I'm scratching my head to recall correctly. I think that Herbert played higher on the team than Bill did, high school, but he was older too. So you have to remember that. But an important point in Bill's upbringing, both as a tennis player and as an individual, came in 1915 when he was 22 years old. Now, Bill played a good number of tournaments, as did Herbert, and he had a U.S. ranking at that time, but his ranking was number 70 in the country. And you think, wow, Bill Tilden ranked 70th? And by the time that year had rolled around, not only was there the blow of the Tilden's father dying, but Herbert died as well. As I recall, it was something like a virus. And Bill was shattered by this double tragedy. And he was taking courses for a law degree, but he was very aimless about it. He didn't really know what he was looking for in his life at that point, but he knew what he didn't want, and he wasn't going to become an academician or a lawyer. So he kind of shut himself it's coming hard to me, shut himself off from the world, went into his room and began reading about the game of tennis, studying it, and above all, practicing it. And he pretty much decided at that point that he was going to make up his mind to be a great tennis player. Now, this was 1915, as I said, 22 years old. And, funny thing, I was reminded of Johnny Cash, of all people, how in 1967, where Johnny Cash, his life was in turmoil, drug infested and all the rest of it. And he went into the woods and made his decision that he was going to go the other way. And then he came out and I guess largely swore off the drugs. Nobody can be sure. But he got back on his feet and he was larger than ever. Well, that's what Bill Tilden did with the travails in his life.
Yes, he sure went the other way. Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. And then you move on to when he started playing, and he actually had a rival, didn't he, that was very well liked by the fans, a little guy, an Irish American that was really tough, hard-nosed, that people liked, and he was the champion. And what was his name?
Well, he was known as Little Bill McLaughlin.
Little Bill Johnston.
I am sorry.
That's okay. I'm already over it, Ernie, but that's why I'm here. Yes, and he was the U.S. Open champion, or U.S. Nationals, it was called back then in the days of Forest Hills, and he was Californian and beat Bill, and Bill took about 6 months off, I believe, to fix his backhand because he never thought that he would beat Little Bill, who had a semi-Western forehand and, would gut out matches. And he was obviously the rival that Bill Tilden defeated most of the next 7 years when he won 7 consecutive U.S. Nationals. And I believe went about 4 years without losing a match. Let's get into the travails of Bill Tilden.
Okay. Well, as Gary pointed out, Big Bill Tilden finally beat Little Bill Johnston in a gripping 5-setter. And it was around this time that, believe it or not, Bill was virtually unbeatable between 1920 and 1926. If he lost any matches, and they didn't keep records as fastidiously as now, the number of matches he lost, you could count on 5 fingers. And I don't mean to lead into a pun on this right away, but he also lost a part of his finger in that time, which makes what he accomplished all the more amazing. He was running back to retrieve a ball, and he caught his finger in a wire fence. It became infected, and doctors treating it said they had no choice but to amputate it. And Bill said something to the effect of, well, no, you're not going to cut off the whole finger. And he had them cut it off only down to the second digit. The amazing thing is that not only did he play well, some viewers thought he actually played better with the adjustments that he made, on the grip. After that, Gary, you would have a much better idea than me about the adjustments. But so that was Bill really at the peak of his form. In the U.S., there was no one really to offer him serious competition. But across the ocean in France, I'll get this right. The 4 musketeers, Barotra, Cochet, Brugnon, and Lacoste, were quite a force to deal with, especially in Davis Cup, which Tilden played pretty consistently throughout the 20s, although he didn't really play that many Wimbledons. And back in those days, of course, it was a pretty grueling transatlantic shipping trip.
Yeah, it's interesting. The 4 musketeers were they were tough, and they won the Davis Cup several times. And Rene Lacoste was a really interesting person because he not only was a great player, but they called him Le Crocodile. Thus, the Izod shirt with the crocodile on it. The polo shirt was his invention. The ball machine was his invention.
Mm-hmm.
And the T2000 that Jimmy Connors made famous was his invention. So this guy had quite a mind other than tennis, but probably had some of the most famous matches with Bill Tilden in the Davis Cup. And I remember I was playing the U.S. National Amateur Grass Courts at Newport, Rhode Island at the casino. And they always had the Hall of Fame induction, which was a big deal. Bud Collins played in the doubles in the amateur tournament, and everyone gathered. And that year, all four of the Musketeers attended and were enshrined into the International Hall of Fame that year. Not sure exactly. It was late 70s. I believe I remember playing doubles with Steve Denton in that tournament and playing none other than Weller Evans, the longtime ATP supervisor. And as he was a good player from, I believe he was playing at Princeton at the time. So anyway, one of the places, of course, where Bill Tilden also played many matches at the casino. But Bill started having a little problem. He was a kind of a tutor to a lot of the children, and I think he started liking a few of those children a little too much, and had to go to prison, didn't he, Ernie, for a little pedophilia?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, you're underlining an important point about Tilden, and that is his off-court activities, to use a general term for them. But yeah, the relationships with young boys, something that he tried to keep under the wraps. In fact, one of the things that Tilden loved so much about Germany, and he, of course, coached the German tennis team in that climactic match tie that we know about in 1937.
Davis Cup at Wimbledon, sure.
Yes. He loved Berlin at one point, and this was when Hitler was in power in the 1930s. Bill traveled to Berlin, and he said, "I am the most ardent admirer of the German people. I love Berlin." And of course, by that time, the Nazis were closing the gay bars and meeting places under Hitler. But Bill knew of a few, with his friend Gottfried von Cramm, the great German player who was also gay, that he could go around with him. But odd thing about Hitler, when he knew that some of his top Nazi officials were homosexual, but he dismissed it by saying, well, that's a private matter. It's something that you, Heinrich Himmler, the Gestapo chief, should be looking into for the top Nazis. But Himmler was much more willing to go after gay people for a time than Hitler was. And Himmler started building up quite a file on Baron von Cramm. And of course, that meant that Bill Tilden, too, had to watch himself when he was in Germany. And he did, of course, go to Germany several times after Hitler came to power in 1933.
Interesting. Well, as we go along about Bill had to do 2 stints in the prison they called the Farm out in California. But one of the early periodicals of its day, American Lawn Tennis, which you see in the background, and here is a shot of the Queen at Wimbledon during the matches of 1945 during the war years. And interesting thing about this is Bill Tilden had his own column that he wrote called Passing Shots. And He did not endear himself to the hierarchy at the United States Lawn Tennis Association, and he was not too covert about it. Here's a brief excerpt from the 1945 Red Cross effort to try to raise money, where Tilden was still the biggest name, and even at that age, still the biggest name in tennis. And he says, the pitiful turnout of the public for the marvelous array of talent playing in the Red Cross benefit at Forest Hills underlined and italicized once more the utter stupidity of the existing amateur rule of the USLTA as regarding professionals and amateurs meeting for the war efforts. Remember, before Wimbledon of 68 or 69, the pros were separate from the amateurs. When one sees an entry list that includes Alice Marble, Pauline Betts, Sarah Palfrey, Cook, Dodo Bundy, Pancho Segura, Billy Talbert, Gardner Malloy, Elwood Cook, Welby Van Horn, Vincent Richards, Dick Skeen, John Nogrady, Frank Shields, Brooks' grandfather, John Nogrady, Seymour Greenberg, Manuel Alonso, Bob Peacock, Lloyd Budge, and myself. Then the stupid rule rears its ugly head, and we find that a civilian pro and a civilian amateur cannot play each other. What do we get? Amateurs playing amateurs and pros playing pros, to the ultimate glory of empty seats and a small return of money to the Red Cross. How idiotic when in the hands of a committee who doubtless wants to play them and couldn't, were a series of matches that would have quadrupled the gate each day. So as you can see, he wasn't making too many friends in the USLTA. And he goes, personally, I feel the Red Cross is more important these days than the sensibilities of a small group of tennis diehards. So anyway, he didn't endear himself, and he actually, this was years after, of course, the Davis Cup match in England at Wimbledon, and he tried actually to be the U.S. Davis Cup coach, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely, Gary, and was utterly rebuffed by the USLTA powers that be, which gives us probably most of the background for Tilden's decision to coach the German team in that climactic final match in the Davis Cup at Wimbledon, the match between Germany and the U.S. Interesting little anecdote that I'll toss in on that. First of all, during that match, which took place in the summer of 1937, it was held at Wimbledon, and various notables from the Yank side were attending those. Two in particular who were in the audience, sitting right in front of Bill Tilden, now the German coach, were Jack Benny and Ed Sullivan. And it came to a critical point in the fifth set where von Kram was up over Tilden 4-1.
Up over Budge.
Budge. I am sorry. I don't want to
That's
confuse
all right.
my
That's
Americans here. Over Budge. Tilden rather vociferously clapped and screamed, or shrieked at least, about von Kram's mastery. It looked like he was going to roll through. And Ed Sullivan became so incensed. He pulled off his coat and he reached back and said, "You traitor!" But he had to calm down quickly because they're beginning play. So Tilden was saved the physical onslaught of Ed Sullivan.
Yeah, that's interesting because Tilden fancied himself as a showman himself. He actually made about $500,000 playing pro circuit, even though he played for quite a while. That's a lot of money back then. And in the day, Tilden was as famous as Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey, even though they were playing in a smaller venue. But Bill Tilden would put his money into vaudeville. He was such an actor, and one of his deals was he would let the players in the matches get way ahead, give them a head start, and then beat them in a dramatic fashion, playing to the crowd the whole time. And that transferred over into, I guess it was the days of vaudeville, where he put money and, as Ernie reminded me, actually was in these movies and plays as an actor, because he was kind of a frustrated actor. You hear tennis players always want to be musicians in a band, and band guys. Elton John always wanted to be a tennis player. And it's funny how Tilden, who ran with the Charlie Chaplins and Doug Fairbanks of the world, really, I think, had a little angst that he wasn't on stage as well, because he was, I guess you would say, he was a narcissistic fellow.
Well, you know, keeping it in the sports family, Gary, just a short aside, Joe Frazier, the boxer, he also tried to do some singing after he was,
That's right,
heavyweight champion of the world. And as one of my favorite sports writers wrote, he goes, well, Joe can't sing, but who's going to tell him? You didn't have quite the same danger telling that to Tilden, I suppose. But
well, he may have been frustrated from Muhammad Ali getting all of the publicity, but Tilden was he was loving it. As a matter of fact, after his second stint in prison and getting out, he was pretty much shunned and ostracized by the public. But the one place where he would teach tennis lessons was at Charlie Chaplin's house in Beverly Hills, and there's pictures of him there and the beautiful tennis court that was on the Chaplin estate. But he liked to rub shoulders with people. And Ernie, you mentioned to me that Ty Cobb was eventually a friend of his that spent a lot of time. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's something that I can't really elaborate on at length because there isn't much further information. But the story goes, Ty Cobb came to one of Tilden's matches because, as Gary indicated, Tilden was truly larger in life in the 20s. Some people felt that his draw was even greater than Babe Ruth's. But anyway, here you got Ty Cobb watching Tilden play/act out on the court, and Cobb shrieks, "Who is that fruit?" However, despite that feeling, the two actually got to know each other pretty well, Cobb and Bill Tilden. So I don't know, maybe to some extent Cobb put his homophobic attitudes to rest then.
No, he was homophobic, that's for sure. Here's a little something that Bud Collins wrote concerning the Davis Cup match, the highly publicized Davis Cup match, where apparently there was possibility that Hitler rang von Krom up in the locker room, and Budge was in there. And that is kind of something that's either myth or really happened. But it says, because von Krom was the underdog and the British thought they may have a better chance in the final against the Germans, the crowd slightly favored von Krom. An oddity was that the Germans were coached by Bill Tilden. It wasn't unusual for a pro in one country to coach another country's Davis Cup team, but it was uncommon for a coach to hold a post when it meant working against his own. Mm-hmm. At one point, Tilden was so animated and rooting, he infuriated American show business celebrities like Jack Benny, Paul Lucas, and columnist Ed Sullivan, a future TV host, who challenged Tilden to a fight. Tilden later told Budge this was the greatest tennis match ever played. I think it was 8-6 in the third, and like Ernie said,
absolutely,
I believe that Budge was down 4-1 in the fifth. Who is Paul Lucas? I know Jack Benny and Ed Sullivan. Do you know who that is?
I don't know, Gary. I think that's beyond my tennis file.
So anyway, but Bill Tilden turned pro early and played countless matches on the pro circuit. They used to call it the barnstorming tour that Jack Kramer took over from Jack Harris, and can't remember who ran it at first, if it was Vinnie Richards or who. But anyway, he played into his late 40s, in these pro matches. Ernie, anything else that you want to comment on Bill?
Well, I was thinking maybe just a little more on the showman side of Bill and his personalities. But in Jack Kramer's book, My Life in the Game, which I highly recommend. I mean, for my money, it's one of the 2 best books about sports I've ever picked up. But Kramer talked about how Tilden, when he wanted to, his sarcasm could just be so cutting. Not just what he said, but the way he said it, which is so often the case with people. But Kramer said, for example, that Tilden was aghast at his developing the serve and volley game, which Kramer claims in the book he developed for the sole reason it was the only way he could beat Bobby Riggs. But Tilden was a purist. He was more the artist, more the showman, and he believed in the all-court game, not just being this one-dimensional serve and volleyer. But I also wanted to bring up Fred Perry, the great Fred Perry, who Tilden played more than once. And he rather snootily said about Perry, Perry is the best almost great player I've ever seen. Sort of damning him with faint praise, you might say. But I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, I was going to say that couldn't have been the sarcastic edge. It must have been something that also didn't endear him to the USLTA.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that Bill Tilden wrote several books, but Match Play and the Spin of the Ball is one of probably his most famous. Excuse me, we don't have a sneeze button on here. But in Match Play and Spin of the Ball, he taught me something that was very important when I was coming up. It really served me well. And that was that the ball is an independent third party. You have yourself, you have your opponent, and the ball is an independent third party that will obey you. And whatever you tell it to do, it will do. And once you get that, I found that to be true, because what he was saying, if you hit the outside of the ball to the right, it's going to go left. If you hit the left side of the ball, it's going to go right. And if you hit underneath the ball, it's going to go up and it's going to produce this spin. And if you slice, Tilden had a great chop shot back in the day, which is spinning the ball from like a service motion off of a bounce. And basically what he was teaching was the physics of centripetal force. And what centripetal force is, you have a ball here and you hit the side of this ball. What it is it's a force that goes towards the middle of an axis. So if you're going over the top to get top spin, the ball's spinning over the top like this. It's going towards the middle of its axis, intrinsic, inside. If you hit a sharp angle, you hit the left side of the ball, it's going to go right, because that ball is going to be spinning around and creating that centripetal force going this way. So you've got side spin, top spin, and slice. And obviously Tilden was a master of that. I might add there's one other thing. People that have a kick serve where it goes halfway across and halfway up, that's the Z-axis on a bar graph. You got the X and the Y and the Z that goes 45-degree angles. So Tilden was ahead of his time because he was talking physics, even though he wasn't using those scientific principles. He was just telling the ball will obey you as far as how you hit it. So, Ernie, I think that's about all the time we have today. Thanks for your input on
Enjoyed it, Gary.
On Cricket Town and Germantown.
Well, books are wonderful things, and you can learn plenty there too.
Yes, there's a great book. That's the biography on Bill Tilden. You can get it on Amazon or in your library, I'm sure. It's called Big Bill Tilden by Frank DeFord. the sports writer that, of course, was involved in many sports, but the triumphs and the tragedy. And it's a real good human interest story. So we'll say now, bye for now, and we'll see you next time.
Hope to see you
Ernie,
again. Yes.
say goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Oops. Well, hold on a second. Bye-bye again.
So long, folks.